the rolling hills of what would one day be called KwaZulu-Natal, where the morning mist clings to emerald grasslands and the acacia trees stand sentinel against endless blue horizons, there once lived a child whose destiny would reshape the very fabric of southern Africa. This is the story of Shaka Zulu, a tale that begins in shame and exile, but rises like the African sun to illuminate one of history's most remarkable transformations, the rise of a broken boy who would become the founder of the mighty Zulu Empire. If you use these videos to fall asleep, subscribe so you don't miss any new ones. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the video and any suggestions you have for future ones. The year was approximately 1787, and the great continent of Africa hummed with the quiet rhythms of countless small kingdoms and clans, each following traditions as old as the Red Earth itself. Among these was the Zulu clan, a modest group of fewer than 1,500 souls who tended their cattle along the banks of the White Umfolozi River, never dreaming that their name would one day echo across the world. Their chief, Senzangakona, was a man caught between duty and desire, between the rigid customs of his ancestors and the stirrings of his own heart. It was during the gentle season of summer rains that Senzangakona's path crossed with that of Nandi, an orphaned princess from the neighboring Langani clan. She moved with the grace of a reed in the wind, her eyes holding depths of wisdom earned through early loss and hardship. Their meeting was not merely chance, but the weaving of fate itself, though neither could foresee the momentous consequences that would flow from their forbidden union. The customs of the Nguni people were ancient and unbending, woven into the very soul of their society, like the intricate patterns on a master weaver's cloth. When warriors returned from their duties, there were rituals of purification, sacred ceremonies that maintained the delicate balance between the world of men and the realm of the ancestors. Among these was ukulabonga, a practice of intimate contact that stopped short of full union, designed to cleanse the spirit while respecting the boundaries set by generations of wisdom. But love, as it has done since the dawn of time, found a way to transcend the barriers erected by tradition. In the soft shadows of evening, beneath stars that had witnessed countless human dramas, Senzangakona and Nandi crossed the line that custom had drawn in the earth. When the seasons turned and Nandi's condition became apparent, the revelation sent ripples of shock through both clans like stones thrown into still water. Senzangakona, faced with the impossible choice between his growing love and his duty as a chief, initially chose the path of denial. "It cannot be," he declared to the assembled elders, his voice carrying the weight of desperation. "The woman suffers from Shaka, the intestinal beetle that causes such swelling." From this dismissive explanation would come the name of the child who would one day unite a nation. Shaka, marked from birth by the circumstances of scandal and rejection. When the child finally came into the world, he entered it surrounded by whispers and sideways glances, blessed with his mother's fierce spirit and his father's stubborn determination, yet cursed by the stigma of illegitimacy that would shadow his early years. The midwives who attended his birth could never have imagined that they were witnessing the arrival of one who would revolutionize the art of warfare and forge an empire from the scattered clans of southern Africa. Young Shaka's childhood unfolded like a harsh season that refused to end, marked by the constant ache of belonging nowhere and being wanted by no one. When he reached his 6th year, the weight of social pressure finally proved too much for Senzangakona to bear. The whispers had grown into open criticism, the sideways glances had hardened into outright hostility, and the chief found himself forced to choose between his position and his forbidden family. The day of separation came with the cruel efficiency of an approaching thunderstorm. Nandi was told to gather her few possessions and take her son to her natal clan, the Langeni, where they might find the acceptance denied them among the Zulu. As they walked away from the only home Shaka had ever known, the boy turned back once to see his father standing in the doorway of the great hut, a figure already receding into memory. The Langeni received them with the cold courtesy reserved for unwanted relatives, providing shelter but little warmth, food but no genuine welcome. Shaka learned early to read the subtle signs of rejection, the way conversations stopped when he approached, how other children were called away when he sought to join their games, the manner in which adults' eyes would slide past him as if he were invisible. The cruelty of children can cut deeper than any blade, and Shaka felt its edge daily. The Langeni boys, emboldened by their parents' attitudes, made sport of tormenting the bastard prince. They would mock his claims to royal blood, push him away from the communal meals until he learned to grab what food he could and retreat to eat alone, and remind him constantly that he was there only on sufferance. These experiences etched themselves deep into his soul, creating wounds that would never fully heal, but would instead transform into an unquenchable drive to prove himself worthy of respect. Yet even as the boy endured these daily humiliations, something remarkable was taking shape within him. Observers would later note the way his eyes followed the movements of the older boys practicing with their fighting sticks, how he absorbed every lesson about cattle herding and tribal lore even when he seemed to be ignored, and the quiet intensity with which he carried himself despite his lowly status. Like a tree growing in rocky soil, Shaka was learning to draw strength from harsh conditions, developing the resilience that would serve him well in the trials to come. The turning of seasons brought both hope and despair to the scattered settlements of the eastern Nguni peoples. Years of plenty would give way to seasons of want, and the delicate balance between survival and catastrophe could shift as quickly as clouds across the vast African sky. Around 1802, when Shaka had reached his 15th year, such a time of testing arrived in the form of Madlintool, the Great Famine, that would be remembered in oral tradition for generations to come. The rains that year came too late and ended too early, leaving the maize to wither in the fields and the pastures to turn brown and brittle under the relentless sun. Cattle grew thin and weak, their ribs showing like the framework of unfinished huts, and the people began to make the hard decisions that famine always demands. Families that had lived together for generations found themselves forced to scatter in search of food, and the bonds of kinship that normally bound communities together began to fray under the pressure of survival. For Nandi and her son, already living on the margins of Langeni society, the famine became the final straw that broke their tenuous hold on belonging. When food became scarce, the first to be forgotten were those who had never truly been welcomed, and mother and son found themselves once again packing their meager possessions for another journey into uncertainty. The Langeni elders, their faces hard with the necessity of choosing who would eat and who would go without, made their decision with the cold calculation that extreme circumstances demand. This second exile was in many ways more difficult than the first, for Shaka was now old enough to fully understand the meaning of rejection and abandonment. As he walked beside his mother on the dusty paths that led away from yet another failed home, he felt the last of his childhood innocence fall away like autumn leaves. The boy who had once dreamed of acceptance and belonging was slowly dying, making room for someone harder and more determined to emerge. Their wanderings eventually brought them to the kraals of the Mthethwa clan, where Nandi's aunt offered them the sanctuary that blood kinship demanded. even when the heart might be reluctant to provide it. Here, in this new place, among yet another group of strangers, Shaka would spend his late adolescence learning the final lessons that would prepare him for his extraordinary destiny. The Mthethwa were a more sophisticated people than either the Zulu or the Langeni, organized into larger political units and possessed of military traditions that would prove crucial to the young exile's education. Life among the Mthethwa offered Shaka his first glimpse of possibilities beyond the small-scale clan politics that had defined his early years. The Mthethwa paramount chief, Dingiswayo, ruled over a confederation of clans that numbered in the tens of thousands, a scale of political organization that dwarfed anything the young man had previously encountered. Here was evidence that African societies could achieve levels of complexity and sophistication that matched anything the wider world had to offer. Yet even in this more cosmopolitan environment, Shaka's status as an outsider continued to mark him for special attention from those who delighted in the sufferings of others. The Mthethwa boys, like their counterparts among the Langeni, saw in the displaced prince an easy target for their cruelties. They would challenge him to fighting contests they knew he could not win, exclude him from the games and ceremonies that marked the passage from boyhood to manhood, and remind him constantly that his royal pretensions were merely the fantasies of a bastard with no real place in the world. But Shaka was no longer the confused and hurt child who had first left the Zulu kraals. The years of hardship had forged something unbreakable within him, a core of determination that grew stronger with each humiliation rather than weaker. When the Mthethwa boys mocked him, he absorbed their taunts in silence, storing each slight away like ammunition for future use. When they excluded him from their activities, he found ways to observe from the shadows, learning their techniques and strategies while they remained oblivious to his attention. Most importantly, Shaka began to develop the analytical mind that would later revolutionize the art of warfare. As he watched the older boys practice their fighting skills, he noticed inefficiencies and weaknesses that no one else seemed to see. The traditional combat methods relied heavily on throwing spears at long range, a technique that resulted in spectacular displays but relatively few casualties. Warriors would dance and posture, hurling insults along with their weapons, in ritual combats that often ended with minimal bloodshed and maximum ceremony. To the young outcast, this approach seemed wasteful and ultimately ineffective. If the goal was to defeat an enemy, why allow them multiple opportunities to retreat and regroup? Why settle for symbolic victory when total triumph was possible? These questions fermented in his mind like grain in a brewing pot, slowly developing into the revolutionary ideas that would transform African military science. When Shaka reached his 23rd year, the call came that would change his life forever. The Mthethwa, like all Nguni clans, maintained age-based military regiments that served both as defensive forces and as instruments of the paramount chief's will. When his age group was summoned for military service, Shaka finally found himself welcomed into an institution where merit and courage mattered more than birth circumstances or social connections. The military barracks, Ikanda, where he would spend the next 6 years, represented a complete transformation from the civilian world that had treated him so harshly. Here, surrounded by young men from dozens of different clans, Shaka discovered the intoxicating power of belonging to something larger than himself. The rigid hierarchy of military life provided clear paths to advancement based on demonstrated ability rather than inherited status, and for the first time in his life, the young man felt the possibility of earning genuine respect through his own actions. Under the tutelage of experienced warriors and the watchful eye of Dingiswayo himself, Shaka threw himself into military training with an intensity that marked him as exceptional, even among his highly motivated peers. He mastered the traditional weapons and tactics with ease. But more importantly, he began to experiment with improvements and innovations that reflected his unique perspective on the nature of warfare. Dingi Swayo, that remarkable leader who had himself transformed Mthethwa society through his own innovations in military and political organization, quickly recognized Shaka's potential. The paramount chief took a personal interest in the young warrior's development, providing mentorship and guidance that helped channel raw talent into disciplined skill. Under Dingiswayo's influence, Shaka learned not just the mechanics of warfare, but the deeper principles of leadership, strategy, and political organization that would later serve him as a king. The relationship between mentor and student deepened as Shaka's abilities became increasingly apparent to all who observed him. His courage in battle was matched by his innovation in training. His loyalty to his commanders balanced by his willingness to question established methods when he saw opportunities for improvement. The praise name, Nodumilezi, the one who when seated causes the earth to rumble, was bestowed upon him in recognition of his growing reputation as a warrior whose very presence could change the outcome of any engagement. During his years of service with the Mthethwa, Shaka's mind worked constantly on the problems he had identified in traditional African warfare. The long evenings in the military barracks provided opportunities for discussion and experimentation, as young warriors shared techniques and debated the merits of different approaches to combat. While his comrades were content to perfect existing methods, Shaka's thoughts turned toward fundamental changes that could revolutionize the very nature of military engagement. The first breakthrough came with his analysis of the traditional throwing spear, the assegai, which had been the primary weapon of Nguni warriors for countless generations. While effective at long range and spectacular in appearance when thrown, the assegai suffered from several critical limitations that Shaka's practical mind could not ignore. Once thrown, the weapon was lost to its user, requiring warriors to carry multiple spears and often leaving them defenseless after a few exchanges. Moreover, the long-range nature of assegai combat meant that battles could continue for hours, with relatively few casualties, as skilled warriors could often dodge or deflect incoming projectiles. Working in secret during off-duty hours, Shaka began experimenting with a radically different weapon concept. Taking a traditional assegai head, he mounted it on a much shorter shaft, creating a stabbing spear that could be retained and used repeatedly in close-quarters combat. The weapon he developed was approximately 18 inches in total length, with a broad, leaf-shaped blade that could inflict devastating wounds in hand-to-hand fighting. The distinctive sound the weapon made when plunged into and withdrawn from flesh would earn it the name Ikulwa, an onomatopoeia that perfectly captured its deadly efficiency. But the Ikulwa was more than just a new weapon. It represented a complete philosophical transformation in the approach to warfare. By designing a tool specifically for close combat, Shaka was implicitly rejecting the ritualistic, long-distance nature of traditional African military engagements in favor of something far more decisive and brutal. The Ikulwa demanded that warriors close with their enemies, look them in the eye, and settle their differences through direct personal combat, rather than ceremonial exchanges of projectiles. To complement the Ikulwa, Shaka also redesigned the traditional cowhide shield, making it larger and more durable, while developing techniques for using it as an offensive weapon, rather than merely a defensive tool. Warriors trained to hook their shields around enemy shields, pulling them aside to expose opponents to Ikulwa thrusts, transforming what had been a passive piece of equipment into an integral part of an aggressive combat system. The coordination required to master shield and spear work simultaneously demanded intensive training and perfect teamwork, raising the overall skill level of military units while creating devastating tactical advantages over enemies still using traditional methods. As Shaka's weapons innovations took shape, he simultaneously developed the tactical doctrines that would make them devastatingly effective on the battlefield. Traditional African warfare, with its emphasis on ritual combat and limited objectives, seemed to him fundamentally flawed from a strategic perspective. Enemies who were defeated but not destroyed would inevitably return to fight another day, requiring endless cycles of conflict that weakened all participants without achieving lasting resolution. In place of this traditional approach, Shaka developed the concept of impia bomvu, total war, a doctrine that demanded the complete destruction of enemy forces and the incorporation of survivors into the victor's political structure. In war, strike an enemy once and for all became his fundamental maxim. Let him cease to exist as a clan, or he will live to fly at your throat again. This philosophy represented a radical departure from African military tradition and would have profound consequences for the entire region. To implement this doctrine effectively, Shaka created the revolutionary Impondo Zankomo bullhorn formation, a tactical innovation that combined the mobility of traditional African warfare with the decisiveness of his new combat philosophy. The formation divided attacking forces into 4 coordinated elements, each with specific roles designed to achieve total envelopment and destruction of enemy forces. The central element, called the Isifuba, chest, consisted of the most experienced warriors who would engage the enemy in direct frontal assault. Their mission was not necessarily to defeat the enemy outright, but rather to fix them in place and prevent retreat, while the flanking elements maneuvered into position. The discipline required to maintain this holding action, often under intense pressure, demanded warriors of exceptional training and morale. The 2 Izimpondo, horns, comprised younger but proven warriors who would move rapidly around the enemy's flanks to achieve envelopment from both sides. The timing and coordination required to execute this maneuver successfully represented a level of military sophistication that had never been seen in African warfare. When the horns met behind the enemy position, they created a complete encirclement that typically resulted in the total annihilation of opposing forces. The 4th element, the unyuva, loins, served as a strategic reserve, positioned facing away from the battle to prevent premature commitment. This reserve could reinforce success, exploit breakthroughs, pursue fleeing enemies, or serve as a rallying point if the primary assault failed. The psychological discipline required to keep reserves out of action during the heat of battle represented another innovation in military organization and command control. The year 1816 brought news that would forever alter the trajectory of Shaka's life. Word reached the Mthethwa military barracks that Senzanga Kona, chief of the Zulu clan, had died, leaving behind a succession dispute that would determine the future leadership of Shaka's natal people. For 29 years, the bastard prince had carried the wound of his father's rejection, the pain of being cast out from his rightful place in the world. Now, suddenly, that same royal blood that had been a source of shame became the foundation for a claim to power. Dingiswayo, who had watched Shaka's development with growing admiration and recognition of his exceptional abilities, saw in this succession crisis an opportunity to place a loyal and capable ally at the head of a neighboring clan. The Zulu, though small in number, occupied strategically important territory, and having them under the leadership of someone trained in Mthethwa methods and personally loyal to Dingiswayo himself would strengthen the entire confederation. The decision to support Shaka's claim was not without risks. There were other potential heirs with more conventional credentials, including Sigujana, Senzangakona's designated successor, who commanded the support of traditional elements within Zulu society. But Dingiswayo had learned to recognize exceptional talent when he saw it, and he was convinced that Shaka's combination of royal blood, military experience, and innovative thinking made him the best choice to lead the Zulu into a new era. The journey home was unlike anything Shaka had experienced before. No longer was he a wandering exile seeking shelter from reluctant relatives. He returned as a warrior commander, backed by the most powerful military force in the region, coming to claim what was rightfully his. The transformation was complete. The humiliated child had become a man of authority. The outcast had returned as a conqueror. The bastard prince would now become a king. The succession struggle, when it came, was swift and decisive. Sigujana and his supporters, accustomed to the small-scale politics of traditional clan leadership, were unprepared for the military efficiency and tactical sophistication that Shaka brought to the contest. Within days of his arrival, the young warrior had established his authority over the Zulu people, beginning the transformation that would turn them from one of the region's most insignificant clans into the foundation of a mighty empire. Shaka's coronation as king of the Zulu marked the beginning of one of the most intensive periods of social and military transformation in African history. The new ruler brought to his position not only the innovations he had developed during his years of military service, but also a clear vision of what his people could become if they were willing to abandon old ways and embrace revolutionary change. His first priority was the complete reorganization of Zulu military forces, according to the principles he had perfected during his service with the Mthethwa. The traditional system of military organization, based on kinship groups and clan loyalties, was swept away and replaced by age-based regiments that cut across family lines and created new bonds of loyalty centered on the king and the nation. The Amabutho system that Shaka implemented represented more than just military reform. It was a complete restructuring of Zulu society designed to create a unified national identity that transcended traditional tribal divisions. Young men were removed from their family homesteads and housed in military barracks, Amakanda, where they underwent intensive training not only in warfare, but also in the values, customs, and loyalty that Shaka wanted to instill in his people. This separation from family influence served multiple purposes in Shaka's grand design. It broke down the clan-based loyalties that had historically limited African political organization, creating instead a direct relationship between individual warriors and the king that bypassed traditional authority structures. It also allowed for the systematic indoctrination of young Zulus in the revolutionary military and social concepts that Shaka had developed, ensuring that his innovations would be thoroughly absorbed by the rising generation. The training regimen that Shaka imposed on his warriors was revolutionary in its intensity and comprehensiveness. Physical conditioning became a central focus, with daily marches of 20 to 30 miles over rough terrain designed to build the speed and endurance that his tactical system required. Warriors learned to fight barefoot, their feet becoming hardened to the point where they could move faster over rocky ground than enemies wearing traditional sandals. But the transformation went far beyond physical preparation. Shaka instituted systematic training in the use of the ikwa and the coordinated shield work that made his combat system so devastatingly effective. Warriors practiced the complex maneuvers of the bullhorn formation until they could execute them instinctively, even under the stress and chaos of actual combat. Discipline became absolute. Failure to meet Shaka's exacting standards could result in immediate execution, creating a military culture of perfectionism and total commitment that had never existed in African warfare. Within 2 years of Shaka's accession to the Zulu throne, the transformation of his people was complete enough to begin the campaigns that would establish their dominance throughout the region. The Zulu military machine that emerged from this intensive period of reorganization and training was unlike anything Southern Africa had ever seen. A force that combined the mobility and knowledge of local terrain that characterized traditional African armies, with innovations in weapons, tactics, and organization that gave them overwhelming advantages over any opponents. The first campaigns were carefully chosen to demonstrate the effectiveness of Shaka's methods, while building the confidence and experience of his warriors. He targeted neighboring clans whose territories bordered Zulu lands, offering them a choice that would become his standard diplomatic approach: submit voluntarily and be incorporated into the growing Zulu nation, with their chiefs retaining subordinate authority, or resist and face complete destruction. This policy reflected both practical wisdom and Shaka's understanding of human psychology. Most leaders, when confronted with overwhelming force and offered reasonable terms, would choose survival over heroic resistance. Those who chose submission discovered that Shaka's promises were genuine. Chiefs who acknowledged Zulu sovereignty were allowed to retain their positions as regional administrators within the expanding kingdom. Their people were protected from external threats, and their young men were recruited into Zulu regiments where they could earn advancement based on merit rather than birth. This generous treatment of voluntary submission contrasted sharply with the fate that awaited those who chose resistance. When clans refused Shaka's offers of incorporation, they faced the full fury of the revolutionary military system he had created. The bullhorn formation, executed by warriors trained to perfection and armed with the devastating Ikilwa, proved capable of achieving the total victory that traditional African warfare had never accomplished. Entire enemy forces would be encircled and annihilated, their cattle captured, their territory occupied, and their survivors incorporated into Zulu regiments where they would learn to serve their new king with the same loyalty they had once given to their former chiefs. The psychological impact of these early victories was as important as their military consequences. Word spread throughout the region that the Zulu had developed new methods of warfare that rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Chiefs who might have initially considered resistance began to recalculate their options as reports reached them of entire armies being wiped out in single engagements. The mere threat of Zulu intervention became a powerful diplomatic weapon that often achieved Shaka's objectives without the need for actual combat. As the campaigns continued and the Zulu kingdom expanded, a remarkable transformation began to take place among the incorporated populations. The age-based military regiments that Shaka had created served as engines of cultural assimilation, bringing together young men from dozens of different clans and forging them into a unified Zulu identity. His famous declaration that there would be no distinction between original Zulus and foreign Zulus was not merely political rhetoric, but a genuine policy that created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility and ethnic integration. The success of this integration policy was demonstrated by the loyalty and effectiveness of the incorporated warriors. Former enemies fought with the same dedication as original Zulus, often displaying exceptional courage in battles against their former allies. The regimental system created bonds of loyalty and identity that transcended ethnic origins, proving that Shaka's vision of a unified Zulu nation was not merely a political convenience, but a genuine social revolution. By 1818, the expansion of Shaka's kingdom had grown beyond the capacity of neighboring clans to absorb or accommodate. The Zulu military machine, now numbering in the tens of thousands of trained warriors, required constant activity to maintain its effectiveness, and provide opportunities for advancement within the regimental system. What had begun as localized campaigns of consolidation evolved into something far more significant, a wave of military expansion that would reshape the demographic and political landscape of Southern Africa. The first major groups to feel the full impact of Zulu expansion were the Hlubi and Ngwan clans, traditional neighbors who had initially underestimated the threat posed by Shaka's innovations. When these groups finally recognized the impossibility of successful resistance against Zulu military superiority, they faced a choice that thousands of others would confront in the years to come: submit to incorporation into the Zulu kingdom, or flee their ancestral lands in search of new territories where they might maintain their independence. The Hlubi and Ngwani chose flight, gathering their cattle, possessions, and people for mass migrations that carried them hundreds of miles from their traditional homes. But their departure from the region did not end their involvement in the spreading chaos. Instead, it marked the beginning of a cascading wave of displacement and violence that would engulf vast areas of southern and eastern Africa. As the displaced groups moved into new territories, they encountered other clans who had no knowledge of Zulu military innovations and were unprepared for the aggressive tactics that the refugees had learned through bitter experience. The Hlubi, Ngwane, and others who had fled Zulu expansion carried with them not only their possessions, but also knowledge of the military methods that had defeated them. Faced with the need to establish new territories, and driven by the desperation of homeless peoples, they began to apply these lessons in their own campaigns of conquest and survival. The result was the phenomenon that would become known as the Mfecane, the crushing, or Difakan, the scattering, a period of unprecedented warfare, migration, and political transformation that affected virtually every society in southern Africa. Groups that had never directly encountered Zulu forces found themselves facing enemies who employed Shaka's tactical innovations and military philosophy, creating a spreading wave of conflict that extended far beyond the borders of the original Zulu kingdom. The psychological impact of the Mfecane was as profound as its physical consequences. Traditional African societies, accustomed to limited warfare with minimal casualties, suddenly found themselves confronted with total war aimed at complete destruction or incorporation. The old certainties of clan identity, territorial boundaries, and political authority crumbled under the pressure of constant military threat and social upheaval. The chaos and displacement of the Mfecane, devastating though it was for many societies, also created opportunities for exceptional leaders to forge new political entities from the fragments of shattered clans and displaced peoples. The military innovations that Shaka had developed spread throughout the region, not only through direct conquest, but also through imitation and adaptation by other leaders who recognized their effectiveness. One of the most remarkable examples of this process was the rise of Mzilikazi and the formation of the Ndebele kingdom. Originally a subordinate chief under Shaka, Mzilikazi had absorbed the full range of Zulu military and political innovations during his service in the Zulu army. When a dispute with Shaka led to his departure from the kingdom, Mzilikazi applied these lessons to create his own military force and begin his own campaign of conquest and nation-building. The Ndebele migration, which carried Mzilikazi's people hundreds of miles north to the region that would later become Zimbabwe, demonstrated the portability and adaptability of Shaka's innovations. The military system, political organization, and cultural integration methods that had created the Zulu kingdom proved equally effective in very different geographical and social environments. The Ndebele became, in effect, a northern extension of the Zulu Revolution, carrying Shaka's influence far beyond the boundaries of his direct control. Similar processes occurred throughout the region, as other leaders adapted Zulu methods to their own circumstances and opportunities. Moshoshu's formation of the Sotho Kingdom represented another creative response to the challenges of the Mfecane period. Rather than relying primarily on military conquest, Moshoshu emphasized diplomatic skill and defensive strategy, using the natural fortress of Thababosyu as a base from which to gather refugees and displaced groups into a new political entity. The Swazi Kingdom under Sobhuza I and later Mzwati I demonstrated yet another variation on the theme of adaptation to Zulu innovations. By adopting modified versions of Shaka's military and political methods while maintaining their independence through careful diplomacy and strategic alliances, the Swazi created a successful state that survived both the immediate chaos of the Mfecane and the later challenges of European colonization. These new kingdoms represented more than mere political opportunism. They demonstrated the fundamental soundness of the organizational principles that Shaka had developed. The age-based military regiments, the integration of diverse populations, the emphasis on merit-based advancement, and the creation of unified national identities proved to be transferable innovations that could be successfully adapted to different circumstances and leadership styles. By 1820, Shaka's Zulu kingdom had reached a scale and level of organization that made it the dominant power in southern Africa. The transformation that had begun with fewer than 1,500 people along the White Umfolozi River now encompassed over 200,000 square miles of territory and controlled an estimated population of 250,000 people. The military forces at Shaka's disposal numbered over 50,000 trained warriors, organized into dozens of regiments, each with its distinctive shield patterns, war songs, and regimental identity. The administrative system that governed this vast territory reflected the same innovative thinking that had revolutionized Zulu military organization. Rather than attempting to rule directly over such a large area, Shaka created a federal structure that allowed incorporated chiefs to maintain local authority while ensuring their loyalty to the central government. This system balanced the need for unified command with recognition of local traditions and the practical difficulties of governing diverse populations across great distances. The economic foundation of the Zulu kingdom rested on cattle, the traditional measure of wealth and status in Nguni society. But Shaka's innovations extended into this sphere as well. The systematic capture of cattle during military campaigns provided the economic base for supporting large military forces and rewarding loyal service. The redistribution of captured wealth created powerful incentives for military service while ensuring that successful warriors could establish their own homesteads and eventually advance to positions of leadership within the kingdom. Trade relationships with European merchants at Port Natal, modern Durban, added another dimension to Zulu economic activity. Shaka recognized the strategic value of European goods, particularly firearms and ammunition, and established royal monopolies over the ivory and cattle trade to ensure steady access to these important resources. His diplomatic skill in managing relationships with European traders demonstrated the same sophistication that characterized his military and political innovations. The cultural life of the Zulu kingdom during this period reflected the successful integration of diverse populations into a unified national identity. The Zulu language was enriched through incorporation of elements from conquered groups, creating a more inclusive linguistic identity that helped bind the kingdom together. Traditional ceremonies and festivals were adapted to reflect the new realities of a multi-ethnic state, while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions that remained important to all groups within the kingdom. The military pageantry that accompanied royal ceremonies became legendary throughout the region for its scale and precision. The sight of thousands of warriors executing coordinated maneuvers in their distinctive regimental uniforms, their shields catching the sunlight as they moved in perfect synchronization, created a spectacle that impressed both African and European observers. These displays served important political purposes, demonstrating the power and unity of the Zulu state, while reinforcing the bonds of loyalty and identity that held the kingdom together. Yet even at the height of his power and success, shadows began to gather around Shaka that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The very qualities that had made him such an effective military leader and state builder, his intensity, his perfectionism, his absolute demand for loyalty, began to manifest themselves in increasingly problematic ways as the pressures of ruling a vast kingdom took their toll on his psychological stability. The death of his mother Nandi in 1827 triggered a psychological crisis that revealed the depths of emotional dependency that Shaka had maintained. Despite his outward appearance of strength and self-sufficiency, Nandi had been the one constant in his life, the person who had shared his early sufferings and supported him through all the challenges of his rise to power. Her passing left him not merely bereaved, but fundamentally disoriented, as if the anchor that had kept him stable through decades of upheaval had suddenly been torn away. The mourning period that Shaka decreed in response to his mother's death exceeded all bounds of traditional grief and revealed the extent to which personal trauma had begun to override political judgment. His prohibition of agricultural activities during the growing season threatened the kingdom with famine, while his ban on milk consumption eliminated a crucial source of protein for thousands of people. The systematic execution of pregnant women and their husbands, carried out because Shaka believed their joy in procreation showed insufficient respect for his grief, demonstrated how completely rational decision-making had given way to emotional compulsion. The estimated 7,000 deaths that occurred during this period of enforced mourning represented more than a humanitarian catastrophe. They marked a fundamental breach in the social contract between Shaka and his people. The king, who had built his legitimacy on military success and protection of his subjects, was now demanding that they sacrifice their lives and livelihoods to satisfy his psychological needs. Even the most loyal supporters began to question whether the benefits of Shaka's leadership outweighed the costs of his increasingly erratic behavior. The military consequences of Shaka's deteriorating judgment became apparent in a series of campaigns that seemed designed more to satisfy the king's need for activity than to achieve strategic objectives. Veterans who had followed him through years of successful expansion now found themselves ordered into battles that served no clear political purpose and were conducted with a disregard for casualties that contradicted everything Shaka had previously taught about the value of trained warriors. As Shaka's behavior became increasingly unpredictable and destructive, a conspiracy began to form among those closest to him, not from ambition alone, but from genuine concern that his continued rule threatened the very survival of the kingdom they had helped him build. The conspirators included his half-brothers Dingane and Mlangana, both experienced military commanders who had served loyally during the years of expansion but now found themselves questioning whether loyalty to Shaka was compatible with loyalty to the Zulu nation. The decision to resort to assassination was not reached lightly or quickly. Traditional African political culture provided mechanisms for dealing with unsatisfactory leaders, including councils of advisors who could counsel restraint and traditional ceremonies that might help restore psychological balance. But Shaka's absolute power and increasing paranoia had eliminated most of these traditional safeguards, leaving his closest associates with the terrible choice between accepting continued destruction or taking direct action to end it. Mbopa, Shaka's personal servant and one of the key conspirators, represented the extent to which the king had alienated even those who had benefited most from his patronage. As someone with daily access to Shaka, Mbopa had witnessed firsthand the deterioration in the king's mental state and the increasing danger that his unpredictable behavior posed to everyone around him. His willingness to participate in the conspiracy demonstrated that even personal loyalty had its limits when confronted with the prospect of continued chaos and destruction. The planning of the assassination required careful attention to timing and circumstances. The conspirators recognized that Shaka retained the loyalty of many military units, particularly those that had not directly witnessed his recent erratic behavior. Any attempt to remove him would need to be swift and decisive, accomplished before loyal forces could intervene, or the king could rally support among warriors who still remembered his earlier achievements. The opportunity came when the main Zulu army was deployed away from the royal capital on a campaign, leaving Shaka protected only by a small guard force that could be overwhelmed before reinforcements could arrive. The timing was not merely convenient, but necessary. The conspirators understood that their action would be judged not only by its immediate success, but by whether it could be justified to the Zulu people as a whole. September 22nd, 1828, dawned like any other day in the royal capital at Dukuza, with no outward signs of the momentous events that would unfold before the sun set. Shaka followed his usual routine, receiving reports from military commanders, consulting with advisors, and attending to the administrative details that governed his vast kingdom. To casual observers, he appeared much as he had for years, a powerful king in complete control of his domain. But those who knew him best could see the signs of the psychological instability that had become increasingly apparent since his mother's death. His mood shifts were unpredictable, his decisions seemed arbitrary, and his reactions to minor issues were often wildly disproportionate to their importance. The conspiracy that had been months in the planning was now ready to act, its participants steeled by the knowledge that their action, however desperate, offered the only hope for ending the destructive cycle into which their kingdom had fallen. The assassination itself was carried out with the swift efficiency that marked all Zulu military operations. When Shaka received his half-brothers and servant for what appeared to be a routine audience, he had no warning of their intentions until the moment when traditional weapons were turned against him in the very heart of his own capital. His reported last words, "Are you stabbing me?" captured not only his physical surprise, but his psychological inability to comprehend that those closest to him could turn against the king who had brought them to greatness. The choice to use traditional Zulu weapons, rather than the European firearms that were available to the conspirators, may have been deliberate, emphasizing that this was an internal Zulu affair rather than foreign intervention. The symbolism would not have been lost on observers. The great innovator who had revolutionized warfare was killed by the same type of weapons his ancestors had used for centuries, suggesting perhaps that some aspects of African tradition remained more powerful than even the most dramatic innovations. The immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed both the strength and weakness of the political system Shaka had created. His revolutionary military and administrative innovations had created institutions strong enough to survive the violent death of their founder. But the personalized nature of his rule meant that succession remained a matter of individual strength and political maneuvering rather than established procedure. Dingane's rapid consolidation of power demonstrated that he had learned well the lessons of decisive action that Shaka had taught, even as he applied them to end his brother's reign. The death of Shaka Zulu marked not an ending, but a transformation. The evolution of his personal vision into institutional legacies that would influence Southern African history for generations to come. Dingaan's assumption of power brought immediate relief from the destructive policies of Shaka's final years, while preserving the military and administrative innovations that had made the Zulu kingdom possible. The new king demonstrated wisdom in maintaining the essential structures of his predecessor's system, while abandoning the psychological compulsions that had made Shaka's later rule so problematic. The military system that Shaka had created proved its durability by continuing to function effectively under new leadership. The age-based regiments maintained their discipline and effectiveness. The tactical innovations remained standard doctrine, and the military culture of excellence and innovation continued to evolve. Future Zulu military leaders would add their own contributions to the system, but always within the framework that Shaka had established. Perhaps most importantly, the Zulu national identity that Shaka had forged through military service and cultural integration survived the trauma of his violent death. The bonds between formerly separate clans had been strengthened through shared military service, common cultural experiences, and participation in the great enterprise of empire building. These connections proved stronger than the political upheaval surrounding the succession, demonstrating that Shaka's vision of a unified Zulu nation had become a reality that transcended any individual leader. The broader regional impact of Shaka's innovations continued to unfold long after his death through the kingdoms and peoples that had been created or transformed during the Mfecane period. The Ndebele kingdom of Mzilikazi, the Sotho nation of Moshoshu, and numerous other political entities carried Shaka's organizational principles across vast distances, adapting them to local conditions while maintaining their essential characteristics. In this sense, Shaka's influence extended far beyond the borders of his direct control, shaping political development throughout southern and eastern Africa. The timing of Shaka's death proved crucial for the subsequent encounter between African and European societies in southern Africa. His assassination in 1828 removed from the scene the African leader who had demonstrated the greatest capacity for adapting indigenous institutions to meet external challenges while maintaining political independence. The political instability that followed his death, combined with the ongoing effects of the Mfecane, created opportunities for European expansion that might not have existed under his continued leadership. Yet the military legacy that Shaka left behind would prove formidable enough to complicate European colonial ambitions throughout the 19th century. The Zulu military system he had created remained fundamentally sound, and under capable leadership, it could still achieve remarkable victories against technologically superior enemies. The Battle of Isandlwana in 1879, where Zulu forces destroyed a British column using tactics that descended directly from Shaka's innovations, demonstrated the enduring effectiveness of his military doctrine, even against modern European armies. The broader influence of Shaka's military innovations extended throughout the region, as other African societies adopted and adapted his methods to resist colonial encroachment. The emphasis on disciplined training, coordinated tactics, and unified command that characterized Shaka's approach became standard features of African military resistance, from the Xhosa Wars in the Eastern Cape to the struggles against German and Portuguese colonial forces in East and Central Africa. The cultural dimensions of Shaka's legacy proved equally important in shaping African responses to colonialism. The emphasis on African achievement, technological innovation, and political sophistication that his reign represented provided powerful counter-narratives to colonial justifications based on supposed African inferiority, even as European military superiority eventually prevailed throughout the region. The memory of Shaka's accomplishments continued to inspire African resistance and self-confidence. In the 20th century, as African societies struggled to overcome the legacy of colonialism and apartheid, Shaka's story experienced a remarkable resurrection as a source of inspiration and cultural pride. African nationalist movements throughout southern Africa drew on his example as evidence of African capacity for sophisticated political organization, military innovation, and effective leadership. Leaders like Nelson Mandela explicitly referenced Shaka's achievements when arguing for African capabilities and rights. The post-apartheid era in South Africa has seen renewed interest in Shaka's legacy as the country has sought to reclaim and celebrate indigenous historical achievements. Cultural tourism, based on sites associated with his reign, has become an important source of economic development, while educational programs have worked to provide more balanced assessments of his historical significance. This cultural revival represents a form of historical justice, correcting decades of colonial and apartheid-era narratives that minimized or distorted African accomplishments. Modern, scholarly research has contributed to this rehabilitation by moving beyond colonial-era characterizations that emphasized alleged brutality while ignoring sophisticated achievements. Contemporary historians recognize Shaka as a complex figure whose innovations in military science, political organization, and cultural integration represent genuine contributions to human knowledge and social development. This more balanced assessment has helped restore his reputation as one of history's great military innovators and state builders. The global recognition of Shaka's achievements has grown as military historians and political scientists have studied his innovations in comparative perspective. His tactical developments are now understood as contributions to military science that influenced thinking far beyond the African continent, while his approaches to nation-building and cultural integration offer insights relevant to contemporary challenges of political development and social cohesion. As the African sun sets over the rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and crimson that have remained unchanged since Shaka's time, his story continues to resonate with power and meaning that transcends the boundaries of time and place. The boy who began life as an unwanted outcast became the man who revolutionized warfare, transformed societies, and created legacies that endure to this day. In the quiet moments when the wind stirs the grass and the distant call of cattle echoes across the valleys, it is possible to imagine that the spirit of the great king still walks among his people, watching over the land he united and the nation he created through his vision and determination. The military barracks where warriors once trained in revolutionary tactics may have crumbled into dust, but the principles of discipline, innovation, and excellence that Shaka instilled continue to inspire new generations of leaders. The Ikalwa may no longer be carried into battle, but the intellectual courage that led to its development, the willingness to question established methods and seek better solutions, remains as relevant today as it was 2 centuries ago. The bullhorn formation may have given way to modern military doctrine, but the strategic thinking that created it continues to influence military education and tactical development around the world. Most profoundly, the vision of unity that transformed hundreds of separate clans into a single Zulu nation offers enduring lessons for contemporary efforts to build inclusive societies that honor diversity while creating shared identity and common purpose. In a world still struggling with ethnic conflict, cultural division, and the challenge of integrating diverse populations into functioning political systems, Shaka's example of successful nation-building through inclusion rather than exclusion remains remarkably relevant. The story of Shaka Zulu is ultimately a story about the transformative power of human determination and the capacity for individuals to reshape their world through vision, innovation, and unwavering commitment to their goals. It reminds us that the circumstances of our birth need not define the trajectory of our lives, that rejection and hardship can become the foundation for extraordinary achievement, and that even the most entrenched traditions can be transformed by leaders with the courage to imagine something better. As darkness falls over the African landscape and the stars emerge in patterns that guided Shaka's warriors on their campaigns of conquest and nation-building, his legacy continues to unfold in ways both seen and unseen. In every act of courage that overcomes adversity, in every innovation that improves upon established practice, in every effort to build unity from diversity, something of Shaka's spirit lives on. The great warrior king may have fallen to the weapons of assassins, but the ideas he embodied and the changes he initiated continue their march through history with the same irresistible force that once characterized his military campaigns. In this sense, Shaka Zulu achieved a form of immortality that no earthly king can claim. His influence continues to shape the world long after his physical presence has passed into memory and legend. The rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal remain. The acacia trees still stand sentinel against endless blue horizons. And somewhere in the whisper of wind through grass, the echo of Shaka's vision continues to call out to those who would dare to dream of transforming their world. His story, born in shame and exile, but rising to heights of achievement that continue to inspire, reminds us that within each human being lies the potential for greatness that can overcome any obstacle and transform any circumstance. In the end, that may be the most enduring legacy of all. The proof that transformation is always possible, that innovation can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and that the human spirit, when properly directed and disciplined, possesses the power to reshape not only individual destinies, but the course of history itself. The legend of Shaka Zulu lives on because it speaks to the deepest aspirations of the human heart. The desire to overcome, to achieve, to build something greater than ourselves, and to leave the world better than we found it.